I had never, not for a fleeting, paranoid instant, categorized myself as a man prone to unwarranted suspicion. Those insecure, perpetually anxious husbands, consumed by jealousy and mistrust, were caricatures reserved for the garish spectacle of daytime television, their narratives spun for an audience hungry for domestic drama. They were the unfortunate souls who compulsively sifted through their spouses' digital lives, resurrecting deleted messages from digital graveyards, or worse, sculpted in unmarked vehicles, tailing their wives with the grim determination of a private investigator. That archetype, I had always assured myself with unwavering conviction, bore no resemblance to me. Isabel and I, we had been united in matrimony for 8 profoundly significant years, a span of time in which we had, or so I had naively believed, meticulously mapped every contour of each other's souls, every nuance of personality, every hidden vulnerability. But that particular evening, at Julian and Chloe's intimate gathering, a subtle, yet seismic tremor ran through the foundations of my perceived reality. It was one of those comfortably informal get-togethers, the kind where footwear was relinquished at the threshold and a growing mountain of jackets formed a temporary, soft sculpture on the master bed. Their apartment, a charmingly antiquated space, was nestled on the periphery of the city, within one of those venerable brick edifices characterized by floors that groaned like ancient ships and a woefully inadequate provision of parking spaces. It was a haven of coziness, an environment steeped in familiarity. I could, without a moment's hesitation, navigate to the precise location of their wine glasses, a testament to the countless evenings we had shared within those walls. The evening commenced in a manner entirely unremarkable, unfolding with the gentle rhythm of pleasantries and conviviality. Light, easy conversation, like a softly flowing stream, meandered through the room, accompanied by the understated strains of indie music that seemed to weave through the air like a delicate thread. A faint, almost apologetic aroma of something Julian had, with predictable enthusiasm, inevitably over-embellished in the culinary process, hung delicately in the atmosphere. I occupied my customary station, a quiet sentinel by the drinks table, embodying the role of the steadfast, reliably unassuming husband, a cool bottle of craft beer clutched in my hand. My smile calibrated to a degree of politeness just sufficient for the occasion. And Isabel, my Isabel, she was a radiant constellation, seemingly everywhere at once, her presence a vibrant current that animated the room. That was the very essence of her being, magnetic, possessing an almost preternatural ability to imbue even the most mundane discourse, a discussion about the fluctuating prices of organic produce, for instance, with an aura of captivating fascination. Her crimson dress, a daring splash of color against the muted tones of the apartment, shimmered with an almost liquid incandescence as she navigated the assembled guests, her movements fluid and graceful, effortlessly collecting admiring glances, drawing individuals into her orbit like moths to a luminous flame. And there, nestled against the delicate curve of her collarbone, lay the silver necklace, a token of my affection I had bestowed upon her for her birthday the previous year. It was an understated piece, a fragile chain supporting a diminutive, intricately wrought pendant. Tears, genuine and glistening, had welled in her eyes when I had presented it to her. "It's utterly perfect," she had whispered, her voice thick with emotion. That poignant moment belonged to a year ago, yet it felt like a lifetime, a distant, sun-drenched memory from another existence. In those halcyon days, that necklace had been a silent, shimmering promise, a symbol of our enduring connection. Tonight, however, it felt more like an ominous, unspoken question mark, hanging heavy in the air. As the evening progressed, gathering momentum like a slowly accelerating train, the collective volume of the crowd amplified. The generous flow of wine acted as a social lubricant, loosening tongues and inhibitions, while the music, no longer a subtle backdrop, stealthily increased its presence, its rhythm becoming more insistent. People began to coalesce into smaller, more intimate clusters, retreating into shadowed corners for conversations that deepened in tone and confidentiality. I remained tethered to my post near the drinks, half assimilating the fragments of conversation that drifted my way, my attention, more often than I cared to admit even to myself, fixated on Isabel. She was utterly in her element, a vibrant social butterfly, her laughter, rich and melodious, cascading through a group congregated by the large picture window. Her hand, elegant and expressive, rested with an almost imperceptible lightness upon someone's arm, a gentleman I vaguely recalled from Julian's professional circle. His proximity seemed a fraction too close, his attentiveness a shade too familiar, bordering on intrusive. Nevertheless, I sternly admonished myself, forcing down the nascent tendrils of unease. Don't overthink it, Victor. It's just a party. That was, until I heard his voice, a casual, almost throwaway remark cutting through the general hum. Well, Isabel, you didn't particularly seem to mind our clandestine excursions last summer, did you now? The words, though not delivered with any particular force, struck me with the brutal, unexpected impact of a physical blow. It wasn't a shout, merely an offhand comment, punctuated by a self-satisfied chuckle. But in that singular, devastating moment, it might as well have been a damning confession, bellowed through a megaphone, amplified for all the world to hear. I froze, my entire being seized by an icy paralysis. My breath caught in my throat, a strangled, inaudible gasp. Isabel's response was almost instantaneous, a laugh erupting from her that felt alien, a brittle, discordant sound that didn't belong to the woman I knew. It was sharp, almost jagged, like the fracturing of delicate glass on the verge of shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Whoever decreed that married women are forbidden from indulging in a little harmless amusement? A ripple of laughter, easy and unforced, spread through their small group. Natural, convivial, for everyone except me. I was not laughing. My gaze, intense and unwavering, locked onto her face, desperately searching for some infinitesimal sign, some fleeting tell, a flicker of guilt, a shadow of shame, even the faintest glimmer of regret. But she studiously avoided my eyes, not once did her gaze meet mine. She simply continued her animated discourse, skillfully diverting the conversation towards safer, more innocuous territory, a newly released, much-discussed Netflix series, a mutual acquaintance's recent extravagant vacation. The usual conversational detritus employed as distractions. But I couldn't move on. That singular, poisoned moment clung to me with a tenacity far exceeding that of the wedding band on my finger. My mind, a frantic, chaotic engine, raced, desperately attempting to process, to make sense of the incomprehensible. Was it some elaborate, poorly conceived joke? A convoluted cultural reference I was too obtuse to grasp? Some obscure inside anecdote shared between colleagues, utterly meaningless to an outsider? Or was it, in its horrifying simplicity, precisely what it sounded like? I yearned, with a desperation that clawed at my insides, to believe in the benign interpretations, but the leaden, churning pit in my stomach harbored far more sinister convictions. My thoughts involuntarily rewound to the preceding summer. Isabel had enthusiastically embarked upon a demanding new project at her firm, an endeavor that had ostensibly necessitated her working extraordinarily late hours for several consecutive weeks. I vividly remembered her returning home, bone-weary and palpably distracted, her usual vivacity dimmed. She would deflect my concerned inquiries with fleeting, insubstantial half-smiles and perfunctory, almost obligatory, kisses. At the time, I had attributed her fatigue and preoccupation to the immense pressures of her professional life. We all experience periods of intense busyness, I had reasoned. No conceivable cause for alarm. But now, enveloped in the deceptively warm, inviting glow of Julian and Chloe's living room, that charitable interpretation of events felt appallingly naive, profoundly, embarrassingly stupid. I took a long, deliberate sip of my drink, the amber liquid doing absolutely nothing to steady the tremors that had begun to course through me. The remainder of the evening unspooled in a disorienting, surreal blur. Conversations ebbed and flowed around me, a meaningless symphony of voices. People laughed, exchanged jokes, their glasses clinking in cheerful toasts, but I was not truly present. Not in any meaningful sense. I was ensnared, a helpless captive in that single, excruciatingly awful moment, replaying it ad nauseum within the tortured confines of my mind. Didn't particularly seem to mind our clandestine excursions. Isabel, meanwhile, appeared blissfully, almost cruelly, oblivious. Or perhaps, a more chilling thought occurred, she was simply a consummate actress, that extraordinarily adept at feigning ignorance. She drifted, in ethereal vision and crimson, from one conversational cluster to another, her smile never faltering, her laughter perfectly timed, a flawless performance of social grace. If she registered my profound, uncharacteristic silence, my statuesque stillness, she offered no outward indication. At one juncture, Chloe, with her usual perceptive warmth, approached me, nudging my shoulder with a knowing, playful grin. You look as though you're meticulously plotting something of great significance, she teased, her eyes sparkling with amusement. Profound thoughts, are they? I managed to summon a weak, unconvincing chuckle. Just feeling the effects of a long week. Exhausted. She didn't press the issue further. Why would she? To everyone else in that room, Isabel and I were the epitome of marital contentment. Solid, unwavering, the aspirational couple one hoped to emulate upon reaching their 30s. But beneath that carefully constructed veneer, something fundamental, something irreplaceable, had irrevocably cracked. I navigated the rest of the evening on a kind of grim autopilot, nodding absently at anecdotes I barely registered, refilling my drink more from ingrained habit than any genuine thirst. All the while, my mind, like a broken compass, kept relentlessly circling back to Isabel's damning words and his before them. Whoever decreed that married women are forbidden from indulging in a little harmless amusement? That was the precise moment the veil was torn. Or, at least, the moment I ceased being capable of perpetuating the lie to myself. She hadn't merely misspoke. That wasn't a careless, ill-conceived jest. It was a fissure, a gaping crack in the meticulously maintained mask. And for the very first time, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, I glimpsed the stranger lurking behind it. When the night finally, mercifully, began to wind down, and the guests commenced the ritual of retrieving their outerwear, I observed Isabel as she bid her farewells. She embraced Julian warmly, pressed a light, sisterly kiss to Chloe's cheek, and thanked them effusively for a truly delightful evening. Her performance remained impeccable, flawless to the last. As we stepped out into the crisp, cool embrace of the night air, she looped her arm through mine, leaning into me with an easy familiarity, as if the preceding hours had been entirely devoid of incident, as if no poisonous seeds of doubt had been sown. Splendid party, wouldn't you agree? She murmured, her breath misting visibly in the chilled atmosphere. Indeed, I replied, the single word feeling unnaturally heavy, like a lead weight in my mouth. She either failed to detect the taut, underlying tension in my tone, or, more likely, she consciously chose to disregard it. Either way, we walked to the car in a heavy, suffocating silence. The only audible sound was the crunch of our footsteps on the loose gravel of the inadequate parking lot, each step an echoing punctuation mark in the unraveling narrative of our marriage. Within that profound silence, my mind screamed, a torrent of unvoiced accusations and desperate questions. I yearned to confront her, to halt abruptly in the desolate expanse of that parking lot and demand, with all the fury and pain coiling within me, unequivocal answers. Asterisk what transpired last summer? Isabel? What in God's name did you intend by that remark back there? Is there another man? Asterisk. But I remained silent. Cowardice, perhaps. Or maybe it was something far more insidious. The paralyzing fear of hearing the unvarnished truth, because once the truth is unleashed, it cannot be unspoken, cannot be unheard. It becomes an immutable, inescapable reality. And in that precise, fragile moment, I was utterly unprepared for my meticulously constructed world to detonate and collapse into irretrievable ruin. So, I held my tongue. We drove homeward, the car radio valiantly attempting to fill the cavernous void where our easy, flowing conversation once resided. Isabel hummed along softly to a song she had once professed to adore, a nostalgic melody that now seemed to mock me with its cheerful indifference. I kept my gaze rigidly fixed on the ribbon of road unfurling before us, my hands gripping the steering wheel with a steady, almost preternatural calm, even as the entirety of my inner world was violently unraveling, teetering on the precipice of chaos. When we finally arrived at our shared residence, she leaned in and kissed me goodnight, a familiar, practiced gesture, as if nothing of consequence had altered the landscape of our lives. But everything, absolutely everything, had irrevocably changed. That night, lying awake beside her, the space between us feeling like an unbridgeable chasm, I stared blankly at the familiar patterns on the ceiling and confronted a realization so devastating it threatened to obliterate me. The version of Isabel I had cherished, the woman I mistakenly believed I knew with an almost telepathic intimacy, that cherished individual might no longer exist. Or, a far more chilling and unbearable possibility, perhaps she never truly had. The insidious nature of suspicion is that once it successfully infiltrates the mind, once it takes root in the fertile soil of doubt, it refuses to relinquish its hold. It lingers, a persistent, unwelcome guest, festering like an untended wound, inexorably growing into something monstrous, something far larger and more unmanageable than you could ever control. After that fateful, revelatory night at Julian and Chloe's otherwise innocuous gathering, things, by all outward appearances, should have reverted to their previous state of normalcy. That, I believe, is what Isabel, in her profound misjudgment or calculated denial, anticipated. The following morning, she was the very picture of her usual self, a seamless continuation of the Isabel I thought I knew. She moved through our kitchen with an easy grace, preparing coffee, her attention intermittently captured by the glowing screen of her phone, humming a cheerful, tuneless melody to herself. Disturbingly, she was still adorned in that same crimson dress she had worn to the party, the fabric now slightly creased, a silent, unwelcome reminder of the previous night's revelations. It was as if the earth-shattering events had never transpired, as if we hadn't, in fact, irrevocably crossed some invisible, critical line in the sand of our relationship. She extended a steaming mug of coffee towards me, her smile as radiant and untroubled as a summer sunrise, and inquired with breezy nonchalance if I had any particular plans for the day. Her voice was light, utterly casual, almost unnervingly effortless, but all I could hear, reverberating in the echoing chambers of my mind, was the ghostly refrain of her words from the night before. Whoever decreed that married women are forbidden from indulging in a little harmless amusement? I took a tentative sip of the coffee. It tasted acrid, unpleasantly bitter on my tongue, a reflection of the poison now coursing through my veins. Over the ensuing days, I found myself utterly unable to shake the pervasive, unsettling sensation that everything was fundamentally, irrevocably askew. Not merely the events of that specific night, not just that single, damning moment of overheard conversation, but the entirety of the timeline leading up to it. The disparate, previously innocuous pieces of a disturbing puzzle began to fall into place with an unwelcome, inexorable clarity, whether I desired them to or not. It began with seemingly insignificant observations, subtle shifts in her behavior that, in isolation, might have been easily dismissed. The way her mobile phone, once casually tossed aside, was now invariably positioned face down on any surface, as if guarding a trove of forbidden secrets. The new, almost obsessive habit she had developed of taking it with her absolutely everywhere, to the kitchen while preparing meals, into the sanctuary of the bathroom, even on brief excursions to retrieve the mail from the curbside box. This was a distinct departure from her previous habits. There was a time, not so long ago, when her phone would lie forgotten and unattended on the sofa for hours on end. Now, it was practically an extension of her being, fused to her hand. Then there were the increasingly frequent late nights purportedly spent at the office. Initially, these had seemed perfectly plausible, almost expected. Pressing deadlines, ambitious new projects, the relentless, demanding grind of her high-powered career. But then, these late nights began to morph into a predictable, almost ritualistic routine. Tuesdays, Thursdays, sometimes even extending into the sacrosanct territory of weekends, always accompanied by an excuse so perfectly reasonable, so meticulously constructed, it felt almost rehearsed. A crucial meeting had unexpectedly overrun its allotted time. A last-minute, urgent task had materialized out of nowhere. An exceptionally important client, whose whims simply had to be accommodated, required her immediate attention. But when she finally walked through the door on those protracted evenings, there was an undeniable, albeit subtle, alteration in her aura. A strange, unfamiliar scent clung tenaciously to her clothing, to her hair. Not her customary light, floral perfume, the one I had gifted her for our anniversary, but something far muskier, sharper, undeniably masculine, the kind of insistent fragrance one doesn't typically acquire from the sterile, recirculated air of a cramped, impersonal office space or a crowded conference room. I recall querying her about it once, making a concerted effort to keep my tone light, almost teasing, devoid of any accusatory undertones. She had smiled, a quick, dismissive flash of teeth, and brushed off my inquiry with a feigned, airy laugh. "Oh, that peculiar odor? It's most likely from a new, experimental shampoo I'm trying," she had said, waving her hand with an exaggerated gesture of nonchalance. "Or perhaps it's just the lingering scent from some of the gentlemen at the office. You're well aware of how those confined conference rooms can become saturated." It was such a practiced, polished response. Too smooth, too impeccably prepared. That was the precise moment a chilling realization dawned upon me. This wasn't a spontaneous explanation. She had been rehearsing, perfecting her alibis. The more I meticulously trawled through the archives of my memory, the more disturbingly clear the pattern became. The subtle, almost imperceptible emotional distance that had crept into our interactions, the persistently vague and unsatisfying answers to my questions, the practiced, almost reflexive way she would skillfully dodge any queries of a more personal or probing nature with a swift, distracting kiss or an abrupt, jarring change of subject. At some indeterminate point in our shared history, Isabel had commenced the clandestine construction of formidable walls around herself, quiet, insidious barriers, erected brick by silent brick, and I, in my blind, trusting complacency, hadn't even registered their presence until they loomed over me, casting long, ominous shadows across our marriage. Our conversations, which once flowed with the effortless, natural rhythm of a meandering river, had become stunted and superficial. We used to discourse on every conceivable topic, sharing the minutiae of our respective days, our most cherished dreams, our deepest fears, even the seemingly insignificant, trivial details that ultimately weave the rich tapestry of a shared life. But lately, those once vibrant exchanges felt heavily edited, meticulously sanitized, stripped of all genuine emotion and vulnerability. I would inquire about her day, and she would invariably offer the same hollow, pre-packaged phrases. Productive, yet rather unexciting. Nothing particularly noteworthy, just the usual grind. Each time she uttered those empty platitudes, it felt like a carefully constructed placeholder, a verbal barrier designed to keep me at arm's length, to maintain a safe, unbridgeable distance. I desperately tried to convince myself that this was merely a temporary, challenging phase, a cyclical downturn that every long-term marriage inevitably encounters and endures. But that flimsy, self-deceptive excuse wore perilously thin with alarming rapidity, especially as the disquieting signs continued to accumulate, forming an undeniable mountain of doubt. One evening, she returned home considerably later than her usual hour. She claimed to have been detained at an impromptu team dinner, a spontaneous celebratory event. However, when I subsequently, almost reflexively, checked our shared digital calendar, a meticulously maintained chronicle of our intertwined lives, there was absolutely no mention, no trace, of any such engagement. Isabel was, by nature, extraordinarily scrupulous and organized regarding her calendar. It had always been thus. She practically lived by its dictates. Every appointment, every meeting, even casual brunch engagements with friends, everything, without exception, was diligently recorded therein. Everything, it now appeared, except for this particular, phantom team dinner. I desperately wanted to cling to the hope that it was a simple, forgivable oversight, a momentary lapse in her usually flawless organizational skills, perhaps a technical glitch in the system. But deep within the recesses of my being, in that gut-level instinct that rarely errs, I knew better. I began to pay closer, more scrupulous attention, quietly, almost surreptitiously, carefully observing her every move, her every word. When she momentarily left her laptop unattended, a rare occurrence these days, I would cast a furtive, fleeting glance at her open browser tabs. Nothing overtly incriminating ever presented itself, just the usual assortment of work-related emails, complex spreadsheets filled with incomprehensible data, the occasional abandoned online shopping cart brimming with aspirational purchases. But the truly significant conversations, the ones that held the potential to reveal the unvarnished truth, they were conspicuously absent from that digital domain. She was intelligent, exceptionally so. Too intelligent, too cunning for such careless indiscretions. Her phone, on the other hand, had transformed into an impenetrable fortress, a veritable Fort Knox of personal data. Complex, multi-character passwords, sophisticated Face ID recognition, even a newly acquired privacy screen protector that rendered the display utterly opaque and unreadable from any peripheral angle. These were subtle changes, to be sure, but they were undeniably new. Precautions she had never previously deemed necessary. I refrained from uttering a single word of my burgeoning suspicions. Not yet. But the silence between us, once a comfortable, companionable presence, grew progressively heavier, more oppressive, with each passing day, each unasked question, each unspoken fear. There were fleeting, agonizing moments, small, fragile windows of opportunity, when I seriously contemplated confronting her directly, sitting her down and just asking, point blank, the questions that tormented me. But each and every time, I found myself hesitating, pulling back from the brink. Fear, perhaps, a primal, immobilizing terror of the potential consequences. Or maybe it was pride, a stubborn refusal to acknowledge the possible deception. Or, most pathetically, it could have been that tiny, desperate, flickering ember of hope that I was catastrophically, wonderfully wrong, because once you pose the irrevocable question, there is no retreat, no going back to the blissful ignorance of before. So, instead, I watched. I observed. I transformed into a hyper-aware, silent chronicler of her existence. I became acutely attuned to everything she did, every subtle nuance of her behavior. The almost imperceptible way she would check her phone with a quick, furtive glance, her fingers moving with astonishing speed across the screen, locking it securely before I could even hope to discern anything of substance. The sudden, inexplicable errands that invariably consumed far more time than they reasonably should. The disconcerting way she would consistently avoid direct eye contact whenever I posed even the simplest, most innocuous questions. "Where did your afternoon take you today, my dear?" "Oh, just running a few errands." "Which particular ones, if I may ask?" "Nothing of any real importance." "You certainly wouldn't want to be bored with the tedious details of my grocery runs." Deflection. Always, invariably, deflection. It was an utterly exhausting, soul-crushing charade. This constant, elaborate dance of pretending that everything was perfectly fine, that our marriage was as solid and unshakable as ever, while my intuition, my gut, screamed a relentless, deafening chorus to the contrary. I began to feel like an unwelcome intruder in my own home, a stranger observing a carefully curated, theatrical performance of Isabel that had been specifically staged for my benefit. The real Isabel, the one I was increasingly desperate and terrified to uncover, was demonstrably somewhere else entirely, engaged in a life from which I was deliberately and systematically excluded. And the most agonizing part of it all? She didn't even exhibit the slightest trace of guilt or remorse. If anything, she appeared remarkably, almost unnervingly, content, as if she had successfully made peace with whatever clandestine activity she was concealing, as if her secret life brought her a perverse sense of satisfaction. One particularly tormented night, unable to find solace in sleep, I lay rigid and awake, staring blankly at the familiar landscape of the ceiling, meticulously replaying the events of the last several months in my mind. Every missed dinner, every dubiously explained late night at the office, every forced, brittle smile that failed to reach her eyes. It was all there, laid out before me with a brutal, undeniable clarity, as plain as the proverbial day. And I found myself reeling from the sheer, staggering disbelief that I had been so profoundly, so utterly, blind for so long. This wasn't mere figment of my overwrought imagination. This wasn't some predictable, cliché-ridden midlife crisis manifesting as unfounded paranoia. Something tangible, something real, was undeniably, catastrophically happening. Something that threatened to dismantle the very foundations of my existence. And it was terrifyingly clear that Isabel had no intention of offering any explanation, any elucidation, unless I compelled her to do so. But even then, a chilling uncertainty gnawed at me. I wasn't entirely sure I possessed the strength, the fortitude, to hear her answers, because deep down, in the most desolate, honest corner of my soul, a significant part of me already knew the devastating truth. And that profound, unwelcome knowledge scared me more than anything I had ever faced. The night everything finally, irrevocably, and spectacularly unraveled was not characterized by tempestuous drama. There was no raging storm, no violent thunderclaps, no torrential rain lashing furiously against the window panes, providing a convenient cinematic backdrop for domestic tragedy. If anything, the atmosphere in our home was unnervingly, almost supernaturally, quiet. Isabel had informed me, with her usual air of professional importance, that she was scheduled to fly to Los Angeles for a crucial business engagement, a high-stakes presentation, she had elaborated, involving exceptionally important clients. The familiar, oft-repeated narrative. She had packed with an almost Spartan efficiency, bestowed upon me a goodbye kiss that felt practiced and devoid of genuine warmth, accompanied by a bright, artificial smile, and had instructed me, with a touch of condescension, not to worry my little head about her. I didn't believe a single, solitary word of her fabricated story, but I meticulously played my assigned role in her elaborate deception. I wished her the best of luck with her presentation, dutifully carried her lightweight suitcase to the waiting car, and even stood on the driveway, feigning concern, as the Uber smoothly pulled away from our curb, disappearing into the encroaching darkness. I remained there for a moment, waving like the very model of a devoted, supportive husband. To any casual observer, we probably presented the picture of a perfectly harmonious, successful couple. But internally, I was steeling myself, bracing for the inevitable, devastating impact. That night, the house felt suffocatingly, oppressively empty. Every familiar shadow seemed to loom larger, heavier, imbued with a sinister quality. The relentless ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, usually a comforting, rhythmic presence, now seemed to mock me with its amplified, metronomic insistence. I attempted to distract myself from the gnawing unease, flicking aimlessly through television channels, scrolling mindlessly through the endless feeds on my phone, even making a futile attempt to immerse myself in a book. But nothing succeeded in capturing my fractured attention. My mind, like a moth drawn to a destructive flame, kept circling relentlessly back to her lies, to her betrayal. And then, it happened. A sharp, metallic buzz emanated from my phone, a notification from our home security application. Motion detected at the front door. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, pierced through me. I almost didn't check it. A significant, cowardly part of me already sensed, with a chilling certainty, what I was about to witness. But curiosity, as they say, is a cruel and unforgiving master. With trembling fingers, I opened the application, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and watched with a sense of impending doom as the live camera feed struggled to load. The timestamp clearly displayed 11:47 p.m. The image flickered into sharp, undeniable focus. Isabel, standing on our front porch. But she was not, by any stretch of the imagination, alone. Positioned beside her, his presence exuding an air of casual entitlement, was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in smart casual attire, yet his demeanor was unsettlingly, possessively familiar. His hand rested, with an infuriating intimacy, on the small of her back. An asterisk, a brand, a gesture that screamed ownership. Isabel tilted her head back, looking up at him, her face illuminated by the porch light, and laughed, a soft, conspiratorial sound that twisted like a knife in my gut. In that single, horrifying moment, the air was brutally expelled from my lungs, leaving me gasping and dizzy. She then, with a practiced ease that spoke volumes, punched in the security code to our home, deftly disarming the alarm system, and together, they stepped nonchalantly inside, as if this clandestine rendezvous, this brazen violation of our shared sanctuary, was the most natural, unremarkable occurrence in the world. I watched the damning video clip again, and again, and then again, each successive replay etching the scene more deeply, more painfully, into the fabric of my being, each viewing digging the shards of betrayal further into my chest. There was no room for ambiguity, no possibility of misinterpretation, no desperate mental gymnastics I could perform to explain away the irrefutable evidence before my eyes. This was not a work-related matter. This was not some innocent, late-night visit from a colleague. This was betrayal, stark, unadulterated, and brutally simple. And the most agonizing, soul-destroying part of it all, she looked unequivocally, radiantly happy. I sat there, the phone clutched in my numb, unresponsive hand, a profound, paralyzing inertia gripping my entire body. My mind was a maelstrom of chaotic, conflicting thoughts, racing at an impossible speed, yet my physical form remained frozen, incapable of movement. How long had this insidious affair been unfolding? How many other nights, identical to this one, had there been? All those meticulously fabricated business trips, all those conveniently scheduled, late meetings, were they all, without exception, monstrous, calculated lies? My thoughts drifted, unbidden, to our wedding vows, to the solemn, heartfelt promises we had exchanged, to the intricate, beautiful life we had painstakingly constructed together, brick by loving brick. And then, with a fresh wave of nausea, I envisioned that stranger's hand, proprietary and possessive, on Isabel's back. It felt as if the very ground beneath my feet had violently shifted, threatening to swallow me whole. For the very first time, the abstract, nebulous fear that had been haunting me for months coalesced into something terrifyingly concrete, something undeniable. This was no longer mere suspicion, no longer the product of an overactive imagination. This was proof, irrefutable, incontrovertible, damning proof. A small, detached, almost clinical part of my brain idly wondered how she would even attempt to explain this egregious transgression, what fantastical, elaborate lie she would conjure up this time. A sudden, unforeseen work emergency, perhaps? A distinguished client visiting town unexpectedly, requiring her immediate, personal attention at an ungodly hour? But no, even Isabel, with her prodigious talent for deception, wasn't that audacious, that brazenly contemptuous. not when confronted with indisputable, high-definition video evidence. I remained awake for the entirety of that desolate, agonizing night, watching the soul-crushing footage on an endless, torturous loop. My thoughts and emotions careened wildly, a violent pendulum swinging between incandescent rage, profound, gut-wrenching betrayal, unbearable heartbreak, and utter, stunned disbelief. At one particularly bleak point, somewhere in the pre-dawn gloom, I caught myself emitting a strange, strangled laugh. Not because any aspect of this horrifying situation was remotely humorous, but because of the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of it all. This was my life now. This was the grotesque reality I was forced to inhabit. Sitting alone in the darkness, repeatedly watching my wife clandestinely usher another man into our shared home, the intimate details of her infidelity meticulously recorded in crisp, unforgiving HD. By the time the first faint, gray fingers of dawn began to probe the edges of the night sky, the consuming anger had largely dissipated, leaving in its wake an overwhelming, bone-deep exhaustion, a weariness that permeated every fiber of my being. When Isabel eventually walked through the front door later that morning, her suitcase trailing innocuously behind her, it was like observing a complete stranger, an unwelcome imposter, entering my home. She greeted me with a dazzling, utterly insincere smile, her eyes sparkling with a false, manufactured vivacity as she inquired, with sickening sweetness, how my night had been. Her performance, as always, was flawless, impeccably executed. I offered little in response, just a curt, noncommittal nod. I allowed her to talk, to spin her web of deceit. She rambled on animatedly about the supposed flight, the purported presentation, how utterly draining and demanding these business trips always were. She even managed to artfully weave in a pre-rehearsed, mildly amusing anecdote about the abysmal quality of hotel coffee, likening its taste to burnt cardboard. I found myself idly wondering if she meticulously rehearsed these elaborate monologues in front of a mirror, perfecting her delivery, her intonation, her gestures. As she began to unpack her suitcase, I couldn't help but notice the small, damning details. Her clothes were neatly, almost too perfectly, folded. Not a single, telltale wrinkle, no sign of having been hastily stuffed into a bag. She was, disturbingly, wearing the exact same outfit I had seen her in on the security footage the night before. There were no discarded boarding passes, no rental car receipts littering the bottom of her bag, just a perfectly curated, utterly fabricated lie. I yearned, with every fiber of my being, to confront her in that very moment. I wanted to slam my phone down on the polished granite countertop, to play the incriminating video at full volume, to watch the carefully constructed mask of her composure shatter and crumble into a million pieces. But I refrained. Not yet. Instead, I continued to observe her. She poured herself a cup of coffee, humming that same infuriatingly cheerful song we used to love, a melody now forever tainted by her deceit. She settled herself at the kitchen table, casually scrolling through her phone, her demeanor utterly relaxed, as if everything was perfectly, blissfully fine. But for me, nothing was fine. Nothing would ever be fine again. Everything, absolutely everything, had been irrevocably, catastrophically altered. That evening, long after she had retired to bed, feigning an exhaustion I now knew to be a complete fabrication, I sat alone in the oppressive darkness of the living room. I didn't weep. I didn't succumb to the impotent release of rage. I just sat, motionless, a silent sentinel in the ruins of my marriage. The stark, unpalatable reality of it all began to sink in, slowly, inexorably, suffocating me with its crushing weight. This was real. This was tangible. This was not a figment of my imagination. I wasn't succumbing to paranoia. She was, undeniably, unequivocally, cheating on me. And now, there was absolutely no room left for denial, no refuge in comforting self-deception. My thoughts drifted back to the anonymous man in the video. His face, though unfamiliar, possessed a disquieting aura of belonging. He carried himself with the casual, unthinking confidence of someone who felt entirely at ease, like someone who had been in that exact situation, in our home, on numerous prior occasions. He knew the security code to our building. He was, I sickeningly realized, intimately aware of the camera's blind spots. He was, in a word, comfortable. That casual, entitled comfort stung more than any other aspect of her betrayal. The sheer, unadulterated casualness of it all. For Isabel, this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, a regrettable mistake made in the heat of passion. This was, horrifyingly, routine. I found myself consumed by the agonizing question of how many times she had perpetrated this deception. How many nights had she fed me a meticulously crafted lie about her whereabouts while she surreptitiously brought him into our home, into the very sanctuary where we had painstakingly built our life together. The sacred space that was supposed to represent safety, trust, and unwavering fidelity. The betrayal, like a corrosive acid, cut deeper, more painfully, with every tormenting thought. And yet, through it all, I managed to maintain an almost preternatural calm. Not because the pain wasn't excruciating, because it was, but because I recognized the imperative need to be absolutely certain, to be methodical, to approach this with a cold, calculating precision. This was not going to be an impulsive, emotionally charged outburst. Isabel had been engaged in a protracted, elaborate game of deception. Now, it was my turn to play. I began the grim, systematic process of gathering evidence. I meticulously pulled the security logs, painstakingly reviewed months of archived footage, diligently cross-referenced her numerous business trips with the security application's detailed history. The results were, as I had suspected, utterly, unequivocally damning. This was not an isolated incident, not a one-time transgression. There was a clear, undeniable pattern, specific dates, recurring times, even a discernible, almost predictable rhythm to her clandestine activities. I painstakingly pieced together the horrifying timeline of her infidelity, each new discovery, each confirmed instance of deceit, adding another heavy, unforgiving nail to the coffin of our rapidly disintegrating marriage. I wasn't driven by a thirst for revenge, for retribution. My quest was for clarity, for an unvarnished, unadulterated understanding of the full extent of her betrayal. By the time I had concluded my grim investigation, there was absolutely no more room for doubt, no lingering vestiges of hope, no possible excuses or mitigating circumstances left to consider. Isabel's betrayal was indelibly written in the cold, hard data of timestamps and camera feeds, an irrefutable testament to her duplicity. But still, I hadn't confronted her. Not yet. Because a perverse, morbidly curious part of me wanted to ascertain just how far she would be willing to go, how long she could sustain this elaborate, exhausting charade. I wanted to look her directly in the eye, to listen to her weave her intricate, fabricated narratives, all the while knowing, with absolute, unshakable certainty, that they were nothing more than a tapestry of lies. It wasn't about inflicting cruelty, though a part of me, I confess, derived a grim satisfaction from her unwitting performance. It was about the truth. The cold, hard, unpalatable truth. The ensuing few days unfolded like a bizarre, surreal ballet of deception and feigned normalcy. Isabel seamlessly continued her established routine. Bright smiles, superficial small talk, the occasional, perfunctory kiss on the cheek. She even, with an audacity that bordered on the grotesque, suggested a date night, as if attempting to reinforce the rapidly crumbling illusion of our marital bliss. I played along, a silent, complicit actor in her tragicomedy, but internally, I was meticulously counting down the moments, a grim, silent metronome ticking towards the inevitable denouement. There is a strange, almost unnerving clarity that accompanies the acceptance of profound betrayal. Once you fully, unreservedly accept its devastating reality, it ceases to be a chaotic, overwhelming force. It transforms, instead, into something quiet, methodical, almost serene, like observing the meticulously choreographed final act of a play for which you already know the tragic, inescapable ending. Isabel, in her blissful, arrogant ignorance, believed she was still firmly in control of the narrative, of our lives, of me. She had absolutely no inkling, no premonition whatsoever, that the heavy, velvet curtain was, at long last, about to irrevocably fall. The morning after witnessing Isabel escort a complete stranger, her clandestine lover, through the very threshold of our shared home, captured in stark, undeniable detail by the unblinking eye of our security camera footage. Something within me fractured definitively. But it wasn't a loud, explosive shattering. It wasn't accompanied by a torrent of incandescent rage or a flood of self-pitying tears. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible snap. The kind of clean, precise break that occurs when something delicate and vital shatters so completely, so irrevocably, that you barely register the sound of its demise. I observed her that morning, as she sat with an air of unnerving normalcy at our polished kitchen table, leisurely sipping her coffee, her attention absorbed by the glowing screen of her phone. As if the preceding 8 years of our intertwined existence weren't lying in a million shattered, irreparable pieces on the cold tiles between us. And in that moment, I felt, Nothing. Not a flicker of anger, not a whisper of sadness, just a vast, echoing, terrifying void. Nothingness. When she eventually looked up from her device and offered me a smile, it was a purely automatic, reflexive gesture, as natural and unthinking as the act of breathing. "Good morning, darling," she chirped, her voice infused with a bright, utterly false cheerfulness. "You're awake exceptionally early today." I didn't respond immediately. My gaze was fixed upon her, truly, deeply observing her. Not the meticulously constructed, carefully maintained mask she presented to the unsuspecting world, but the individual, the stranger, concealed behind it. And the undeniable, heartbreaking truth was that the person behind that facade was no longer my wife. She was someone else entirely. I offered her a curt, almost imperceptible nod in return. A bland, utterly neutral gesture. The kind of indifferent acknowledgement one might bestow upon a passing stranger in a crowded street. She, predictably, didn't seem to notice the profound shift in my demeanor. Or perhaps, a more likely scenario, she did register it, but consciously chose not to acknowledge the unsettling change. That, I was beginning to realize, was her signature modus operandi now. Avoidance. Evasion. She was, it had to be said, extraordinarily proficient at it. The day progressed in a manner that was, on the surface, entirely unremarkable. A tedious succession of household chores, mundane errands, and stilted, perfunctory conversations revolving around trivialities such as grocery lists and tentative, unenthusiastic weekend plans. Isabel valiantly attempted to fill the increasingly oppressive silences with her usual stream of bright, inconsequential chatter, and I, with a weary resignation, allowed her to do so. Because for me, the silence, however heavy and laden with unspoken accusations, had become infinitely more tolerable than the exhausting, soul-crushing effort of feigning interest, of pretending. That evening, we sat down for dinner, a ritual that had once been a cherished cornerstone of our shared life. She had prepared my absolute favorite dish, chicken parmesan, generously laden with molten mozzarella and rich tomato sauce, prepared precisely to my liking. She had even gone to the trouble of lighting candles, their flickering flames casting dancing, deceptive shadows across the room, and had put on our old, nostalgic playlist, the melodies now sounding hollow and mocking in the background. It should have been an unequivocally romantic, intimate occasion. Instead, it felt like a solemn, premature eulogy for our dying marriage. I watched her, a detached, clinical observer, as she artfully twirled strands of spaghetti around her fork, regaling me with some elaborate, animated anecdote about a challenging new project she was undertaking at work. Her hands, usually so expressive and graceful, moved with an almost frantic energy. Her smile was wide and dazzling, but her eyes, those supposed windows to the soul, never quite managed to meet mine. It was then that I realized, with a sudden, chilling clarity, what she was doing. She was trying. Desperately, almost pathetically, trying to play the well-rehearsed part of the devoted, caring wife, the attentive, loving partner. But her performance was stilted, mechanical, like an automaton going through ingrained, pre-programmed motions, devoid of any genuine warmth or sincerity. And I, Victor, was utterly, irrevocably done playing along with her elaborate, soul-destroying charade. I offered no response to her carefully crafted stories, no contribution of my usual witty commentary or insightful observations. I simply ate in a heavy, unbroken silence, methodically chewing through each mouthful of the once-beloved dish as if it were composed of tasteless, unappetizing cardboard. When she finally, inevitably, registered my profound, uncharacteristic silence, she paused mid-anecdote, her radiant smile faltering for the briefest, almost imperceptible instant. "You're exceptionally quiet this evening, Victor," she remarked, her voice tinged with a faint, carefully concealed note of unease. "I'm merely fatigued," I lied, the falsehood slipping from my lips with an ease that surprised even me. Another heavy, suffocating silence descended, thicker, more palpable this time. "Are you quite certain you're all right, my dear?" she pressed, tilting her head to the side in a gesture that was meant to convey genuine, heartfelt concern, but which now struck me as utterly theatrical and insincere. I looked at her then, truly, deeply looked at her, seeing past the carefully constructed facade to the calculating stranger beneath. "I am perfectly fine," I stated, my voice devoid of all emotion. "And you, Isabel?" The question, seemingly innocuous, hung heavy and suspended in the charged air between us, far more loaded, far more pregnant with unspoken meaning than she could possibly realize. For a fleeting, almost infinitesimal split second, something unidentifiable flickered across her expressive features. Guilt? Perhaps? Fear? It was difficult to discern with any certainty. But she recovered her composure with astonishing, almost reptilian speed. Of course, I am, she replied, that same bright, artificial smile firmly back in place. Why on earth wouldn't I be? I desperately wanted to laugh, a harsh, bitter, mirthless sound, but I managed to suppress the urge. That night, as we lay side by side in the cold expanse of our marital bed, she curled up beside me, resting her head on my shoulder in a familiar gesture that had once brought me immense comfort, but which now felt like a violation. Her breath, soft and steady against my skin, should have been soothing. For a fleeting, treacherous moment, it was almost deceptively easy to pretend that nothing had changed, that we were still the loving, devoted couple we had once been. Almost. But that cold, hollow, desolate feeling deep within my core refused to dissipate. I stared blankly at the familiar, unchanging landscape of the ceiling, my eyes meticulously tracing the same intricate network of hairline cracks in the plaster that I had observed countless hundreds of times before. But tonight, they seemed to possess a new, profound symbolism. Cracks. Cracks were appearing everywhere, in everything. Isabel murmured something unintelligible in her sleep, shifting slightly beside me. I remained perfectly still, utterly unresponsive, not reacting in the slightest. I was no longer an active participant in this painful, degrading dance of deception and denial. In the days that followed, our interactions became increasingly, almost comically, scripted. Isabel would make a concerted, almost frantic effort. She would suggest impromptu movie nights, strategically bring up cherished old memories, laugh a little too loudly, a little too insistently, at things that weren't remotely amusing, all transparent. Almost pathetic attempts to recreate the semblance of what we used to have, to rewind the clock to a time before the cracks had appeared. But you cannot successfully rebuild a shattered edifice on a foundation composed entirely of lies and deceit. And I, for one, was no longer remotely interested in participating in the charade, in pretending. I became progressively quieter, more detached, a spectral, almost invisible presence in my own home, a ghost haunting the periphery of her increasingly desperate attempts at connection. She noticed, of course. She would have had to be blind and deaf not to. One evening, she cornered me in the kitchen, her patience clearly, visibly frayed. Her hands were planted firmly on her hips, her stance exuding an aura of barely suppressed frustration and rising anger. "All right, Victor, seriously now," she demanded, her voice sharp and accusatory. "What precisely is going on with you?" I continued to methodically rinse my coffee mug under the running tap, deliberately taking my time, drawing out the moment. "There is absolutely nothing going on," I stated, my voice calm, even, almost unnervingly devoid of emotion. "That is utter and complete rubbish, and you know it," she snapped, her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack. "You've been distant, cold, almost unfeeling, like you're not even truly present in this house, in this marriage." I turned slowly to face her, leaning casually against the cool granite of the counter. For a fleeting, tempting moment, I considered telling her everything, laying all my cards on the table. The incriminating video footage, the irrefutable proof of her infidelity, the agonizing, late-night realizations that had shattered my world. But I refrained. "Not yet. I suppose, Isabel," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, "I'm simply tired of pretending." Her expression shifted, a complex kaleidoscope of emotions flickering across her face. Confusion, certainly. Worry, perhaps. And maybe, just maybe, a nascent flash of fear. "Pretending what, Victor?" she asked, her voice noticeably softer now, tinged with an uncharacteristic vulnerability. "Pretending that everything between us is perfectly, unequivocally fine." The immense weight of my carefully chosen words seemed to land upon her with the force of a physical blow, but she offered no immediate reply. She just stood there, motionless, her teeth worrying her bottom lip, her arms, previously akimbo in a gesture of defiance, now dropping limply to her sides. That, I noted with a grim sense of satisfaction, was the very first time she hadn't possessed a readily available, pre-packaged excuse, a plausible, well-rehearsed deflection. After that pivotal exchange, she tried even harder, her efforts becoming almost frantic, bordering on desperate. She began cooking elaborate, multi-course meals, meticulously dressing up in her finest attire even if we had no plans to venture beyond our front door. She started sending me a barrage of text messages throughout the day, punctuated with an uncharacteristic abundance of little heart emojis, inquiring solicitously about my meetings, wishing me luck on projects I hadn't even mentioned to her. It was all just noise, a desperate, cacophonous attempt to drown out the deafening silence that had enveloped us. The more insistently she tried to pull me back into her orbit, to reel me back into the charade, the further, ironically, I drifted away. I ceased asking her about the details of her day. I stopped offering to assist with the grocery shopping or other household chores. Our once rich and flowing conversations dwindled, becoming purely transactional, stripped of all warmth and intimacy. Do you require anything from the supermarket? No. Dinner will be served at precisely 7 Lars. Very well. That was the new, stark, barren rhythm of our cohabitation. At night, she would climb into bed, inching progressively closer to my side of the mattress, her body radiating a desperate, palpable plea for warmth, for connection. But I remained perfectly still, unresponsive, a cold, unyielding statue. My side of the bed grew perceptibly colder, a tangible, physical barrier erected between us, a chilling testament to the emotional chasm that now separated us. And yet, despite my increasingly blatant withdrawal, she persisted. She kept trying, her efforts becoming more and more pathetic, more transparent. One evening, she returned home brandishing tickets to a concert, a band we had both, in happier times, often spoken of wanting to see perform live. She presented them to me like a sacred peace offering, her eyes, wide and pleading, desperately searching mine for any discernible sign of life, any flicker of the old affection. I thought this could be beneficial for us, Victor, she said, her voice trembling slightly, almost pleading. I glanced impassively at the brightly colored tickets in her outstretched hand, then slowly raised my gaze back to her face. Perhaps some other time, Isabel, I stated flatly, my voice devoid of any inflection. She flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement, as if I had physically struck her. That, I registered, was the first occasion she didn't attempt to argue, to persuade, to cajole. The emotional distance between us had become a tangible, almost physical entity, a vast, unbridgeable chasm that neither of us possessed the means, or perhaps the will, to cross. Isabel valiantly, almost pitifully, kept up appearances, but her efforts grew increasingly, almost hysterically, frantic. She laughed louder, her mirth forced and unnatural. She touched me more frequently, her touch now feeling unwelcome and invasive. She posed a relentless barrage of questions to which she clearly didn't expect, or even wait for, answers. It was desperation, pure, unadulterated, and profoundly simple. But it was, unequivocally, far too late. You cannot, as the old adage goes, unring a bell once it has been rung. You cannot unshatter a vase once it has been broken. One evening, as we sat enveloped in our customary, oppressive silence, her phone buzzed insistently on the polished surface of the coffee table between us. She snatched it up with a swiftness that bespoke anxiety, her eyes flickering with that now familiar, telltale nervousness. She undoubtedly believed I wasn't paying attention, that I was oblivious to her clandestine communications. She was, as usual, profoundly mistaken. I watched, with a cold, detached curiosity, as she read the newly arrived message, her fingers hovering uncertainly over the screen for a moment before she decisively locked the device and placed it, once again, face down on the table. Again, I refrained from uttering a single word. The damage, irreparable and absolute, was already done. That night, as we lay in the cold, sterile silence of our shared bed, Isabel turned towards me, her voice barely a whisper in the oppressive darkness. Victor, she began, her voice laced with a raw, uncharacteristic vulnerability, do you still harbor any love for me? It was a simple, straightforward question, one that, in years past, would have been effortlessly, joyfully answered. But now, it was anything but. I stared blankly into the impenetrable blackness, a suffocating tightness constricting my throat. I honestly do not know, Isabel, I finally managed to articulate, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. The silence that ensued was deafening, a profound, echoing void that seemed to absorb all sound, all hope. For the very first time since this agonizing ordeal had begun, Isabel made no attempt to fill it with her usual nervous chatter or forced reassurances. She just lay there, motionless, staring up at the unseen ceiling, mirroring my own countless, sleepless, tormented nights. In that precise, desolate moment, I believe she finally, truly, began to realize. realized that whatever precious, fragile thing we had once shared was inexorably, irretrievably slipping through her desperate, grasping fingers, and there was absolutely nothing she, or anyone else, could do to halt its tragic, inevitable demise. Desperation possesses a distinct, almost palpable aura. It manifests subtly at first, almost imperceptibly, hairline cracks appearing in the carefully constructed mask of composure, forced, brittle smiles that fail to quite reach the eyes, a flicker of unease in the gaze. But soon, if left unchecked, it metastasizes into something far more primal, more visceral, a frantic, almost manic energy, a constant, desperate scramble to regain a semblance of control over a situation rapidly spiraling out of grasp. That, unequivocally, was the precipice upon which Isabel now teetered. She had finally, belatedly, acknowledged that something was profoundly, catastrophically amiss. The emotional abyss that yawned between us was no longer a subtle, nuanced affair. It was a vast, gaping canyon, and like a drowning swimmer thrashing wildly, grasping at any flimsy piece of flotsam to remain afloat, she began to lash out, her actions born of sheer, unadulterated panic. It commenced with small, almost petty provocations, insignificant skirmishes designed to elicit a reaction, any reaction, from me. One morning, she deliberately instigated a full-blown argument over the seemingly trivial matter of the bath towels. I had, apparently, folded them incorrectly. A transgression so heinous, so unforgivable, it apparently warranted a protracted, vociferous diatribe before I had even managed to finish my first cup of morning coffee. Seriously, Victor, how many blasted times must I reiterate this to you? She had snapped, her voice sharp and grating, holding up the offending towel as if it were a crucial piece of damning evidence in a capital trial. The edges are to be folded inwards, not outwards. Is it truly such an insurmountable, complex task? I stared at her, a detached, almost clinical observer, noting the subtle tremor in her hands, the way her eyes were wide and unervingly expectant. She craved a response, any response. She yearned for me to engage, to argue back, to provide her with some familiar fragment of our old dynamic, even if that connection had to be forged through the crucible of conflict. But I refused to grant her that small, perverse satisfaction. Duly noted, Isabel, I stated simply, my voice devoid of all emotion, before calmly picking up my mug and walking away, leaving her sputtering in impotent fury. My deliberate, unwavering refusal to engage infuriated her far more profoundly than any heated shouting match ever could have. The following day, the chosen battleground was the precise placement of my shoes by the front door. Then, it was the egregious offense of the trash not having been taken out with sufficient promptness. And after that, the truly unforgivable sin of leaving the toothpaste cap ever so slightly unscrewed. Every single day brought forth a new, meticulously chosen point of contention. Every single day yielded the exact same, infuriatingly calm result from my end. Silence. My steadfast refusal to be drawn into her manufactured dramas became a polished, unflattering mirror, reflecting back at her an image she clearly couldn't bear to confront. And so, with a predictable desperation, she abruptly changed tactics. The petty provocations and manufactured arguments morphed, almost overnight, into blatant, almost aggressive attempts at seduction. She began to dress with a deliberate, almost theatrical provocativeness around the house. Skirts that were far too tight, blouses with necklines that plunged to daring, uncharacteristic depths, the kind of overtly sensual attire she hadn't deemed necessary to wear in years. At least, not for my benefit. She would accidentally drop objects in my immediate vicinity, bending over with an exaggerated slowness, lingering just long enough to ensure her message was unequivocally received. She would contrive reasons to brush past me in the narrow confines of the kitchen, her hand innocently lingering on my arm for a fraction of a second too long, her heavy, cloying perfume enveloping me in an unwelcome, suffocating cloud. I didn't flinch, didn't recoil, didn't respond in any discernible way. My physical body was present, occupying the same space, but my mind, my essence, was elsewhere, far removed from her increasingly desperate machinations. When these more overt, physical overtures failed to elicit the desired reaction, she escalated her efforts yet again. One evening, she descended the staircase clad in a shockingly revealing piece of lingerie. This was not a subtle, suggestive gesture. This was not casual or accidental. This was a calculated, strategic maneuver. A meticulously chosen ensemble she knew, from past experience, I had once found irresistible, intricate black lace, a deep, provocative crimson silk, delicate, barely there straps. I was seated on the sofa, ostensibly engrossed in scrolling through an article on my phone, when she purposefully positioned herself directly in front of me, blocking my view. "Do you happen to recall this particular item, Victor?" she purred, her voice intentionally soft, husky, and laden with a feigned, sultry invitation. I slowly looked up from the glowing screen of my phone, my gaze coolly, deliberately taking in the sight of her. Once, not so very long ago, this display would have undoubtedly driven me to distraction. Once, this would have been more than enough to ignite a passionate response. But not now. Now, it just looked pathetic, like the desperate, last-ditch effort of a failing campaign. "Indeed, I recall it," I said, my voice even and devoid of emotion, as I calmly set my phone down on the cushion beside me. "It used to signify something, Isabel." Her carefully constructed, seductive smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty, of fear, momentarily clouding her eyes. "Victor," she began again, her tone shifting, losing its sultry edge, becoming more pleading, more desperate. "What is happening to us? To our marriage?" A fair, entirely reasonable question, I conceded internally, but not one I was remotely prepared to answer. Not because I didn't possess the answer. I did, in agonizing, irrefutable detail, but because I was no longer willing to perform the emotional labor on her behalf. She had created this mess. She could damn well figure it out herself. "You tell me, Isabel," I responded, my voice still unervingly calm, as I rose to my feet and deliberately walked past her, exiting the room without a backward glance. She did not attempt to follow me. In the ensuing days, the emotional pendulum swings became even more violent, more erratic. One minute, she would be meticulously preparing my favorite breakfast, her voice bright and cheerful as she hummed along to nostalgic old songs in the sun-drenched kitchen, a perfect caricature of domestic bliss. The very next, she would be inexplicably slamming doors with a childish petulance, her voice shrill and accusatory as she railed against me for being cold, distant, unfeeling, and profoundly unfair. "I am trying, Victor," she shouted one evening, her face flushed, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and desperation. "Can't you see that I'm trying? Why are you doing this to me? Why are you deliberately punishing me?" Punishing her? That particular word, that specific accusation, struck a different, discordant chord within me. I wasn't consciously, actively punishing her. I was simply, unequivocally, no longer pretending. But for her, it seemed, those two states were indistinguishable, synonymous. When her increasingly desperate attempts at seduction proved utterly futile, she reverted, with a grim predictability, to her default mode, control. She began to unilaterally make plans for us, booking dinner reservations at expensive restaurants without consulting me, signing us up for social events we had no mutual interest in attending, generally behaving as if everything between us was perfectly, blissfully normal. It was all a transparent, pathetic attempt to regain control of the narrative, to force our fractured relationship back into the familiar, comfortable mold of normalcy. If she could somehow coerce me back into the established routines of our old life, perhaps, just perhaps, the fragile illusion of marital harmony would magically reconstitute itself. But I resolutely refused to play along with her charade. One evening, she informed me, with an air of forced cheerfulness, that we had dinner reservations at a prestigious, sought-after restaurant, a place we had, in happier, more innocent times, often frequented and dearly loved. "I've taken the liberty of making a reservation for us, darling. 7:30. You'll adore it. It will be beneficial for us." I didn't even bother to look up from the glowing screen of my laptop. "I've already consumed my evening meal, Isabel," I stated flatly, my voice devoid of any discernible emotion. The silence that followed that pronouncement was heavy, thick, almost palpable, crackling with unspoken tension and her barely suppressed rage. When I finally, eventually, chanced to glance in her direction, her face was ashen, her lips pressed together into a thin, bloodless line. I could see the storm brewing behind her eyes. She wanted to scream, to rail, to perhaps even dissolve into a torrent of frustrated tears. Maybe all of the above. But she did none of those things. Instead, with a visible effort, she retreated, her shoulders slumping in a gesture of profound, utter defeat. That night, she sat alone at the large, empty dining table, a half-empty bottle of expensive wine her only companion. She scrolled aimlessly through her phone, her face illuminated by its cold, impersonal glow, probably searching, with a growing sense of desperation, for some form of distraction, for someone else to temporarily fill the gaping, echoing void that I, with my deliberate indifference, steadfastly refused to patch up for her. But even that, I knew with a chilling certainty, wouldn't be enough to save her now. The more profoundly indifferent I became to her increasingly frantic efforts, the more desperately, almost pathetically, she clung to the wreckage of our marriage. And the more tenaciously she clung, the further, ironically, she succeeded in pushing me away. It was a cruel, almost tragicomic irony, a self-perpetuating cycle of her own making. One night, she cornered me again, her demeanor stripped of all pretense, all artifice. This time, there was no attempted seduction, no feigned cheerfulness, just raw, unadulterated, agonizing desperation. "Victor, please," she implored, her voice cracking, on the verge of shattering. I simply don't know what to do anymore. Just tell me what's wrong. Tell me what I did." That was the pivotal moment, the undeniable line in the sand that had been irrevocably crossed. I could have ended it all right there, in that precise instant. I could have retrieved my phone from my pocket, played the damning video footage for her, laid out the irrefutable, meticulously gathered evidence like a judge delivering a final, unappealable verdict. But I refrained. Not yet. Because even in that moment of supposed, unadulterated vulnerability, even as her carefully constructed facade seemed to be crumbling around her, she wasn't asking the crucial question. She wasn't uttering the words, "Did you see what I did?" She wasn't tentatively, fearfully inquiring, "Do you know about my affair?" No. Instead, she was asking, "What's wrong with you?" As if the fundamental problem, the root cause of our marital disintegration, lay solely, unequivocally, with me. I looked at her then, my expression carefully, deliberately unreadable, a blank, impenetrable mask. "You know precisely what is wrong, Isabel," I stated quietly, my voice low and steady, yet carrying an undeniable weight of accusation. The color visibly drained from her face, leaving her complexion chalky and pale. For a fleeting, almost imperceptible second, I saw it, the sudden, dawning panic, the terrifying, gut-wrenching realization. She knew. Deep down, in the most honest, unacknowledged recesses of her soul, she knew that I was no longer playing dumb, no longer willing to be her unwitting, complacent fool. But still, even then, she didn't confess. She didn't break down and admit her transgressions. Instead, with a resilience born of sheer desperation, she shifted gears once more, grasping at yet another flimsy straw. I believe we should consider going away for the weekend," she stammered, her voice shaky, betraying her inner turmoil. "Just the two of us. Somewhere quiet, secluded. We can talk, truly talk. We can reconnect." I had to, albeit grudgingly, admire her sheer, unyielding persistence. Truly, she was frantically, almost comically, grasping at every conceivable rope, every last, tattered strategy in her well-worn playbook of manipulation and deceit. But it was all, unequivocally, far too late. The damage was done, the trust irrevocably shattered. "You should perhaps consider taking someone else, Isabel," I suggested, my voice cold and devoid of any warmth. Her breath hitched audibly in her throat. I don't desire anyone else, Victor," she whispered, the words intended to be a poignant, heartfelt declaration, a desperate plea for reconciliation. The immense weight of her carefully chosen words was supposed to move me, to stir some dormant ember of affection, of pity. But they didn't. Not anymore. The stark, unpalatable reality was crystal clear. I wasn't dealing with the vibrant, intelligent, loving woman I had married 8 long years ago. I was contending with this new, distorted version of her that had emerged from the ashes of her deceit. The version that naively, arrogantly believed that profound betrayal could be easily smoothed over, artfully glossed over with a renewed burst of effort, with strategically lit candles, provocative lingerie, and a carefully curated selection of half-truths and outright lies. But some forms of damage, I now understood with a chilling, absolute certainty, are utterly, irrevocably irreversible. The subsequent days were characterized by a new, unnerving quietude. Isabel's increasingly hysterical outbursts lessened in frequency and intensity. Her desperate attempts at connection became more muted, more tentative, almost apologetic. It was as if she was finally, reluctantly, beginning to comprehend the devastating, unalterable truth: the battle was well and truly lost. that no amount of elaborate cooking, provocative dressing, or strategically deployed nostalgic playlists could ever hope to mend what she, with her reckless, selfish actions, had so thoroughly, so catastrophically, broken. Still, she lingered. Still, she persisted in her futile efforts, but the carefully maintained mask was undeniably, visibly slipping, revealing the raw, desperate fear beneath. And for the very first time since this agonizing saga had begun, I could see the gaping, irreparable cracks in her facade as clearly, as undeniably, as I saw her. Isabel's raw desperation began to curdle, transforming into something altogether darker, more insidious. It was no longer about genuinely attempting to repair the shattered remnants of our marriage. Her focus had shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, towards a desperate, almost pathological need to control the narrative, to salvage her own tarnished image. She commenced a campaign of subtle, then increasingly overt, monitoring of my activities, her inquiries becoming more frequent, more pointed. Where precisely was I going? With whom was I communicating via text message? The profound, almost laughable irony of the situation was not lost on me. The unfaithful spouse, the perpetrator of the ultimate betrayal, now consumed with a gnawing, unfounded anxiety about potentially being cheated upon herself. One evening, I returned home to find her artfully arranged on the living room sofa, clad in a shockingly tight, overtly revealing dress, her makeup applied with a theatrical, almost garish perfection. The ambient lighting in the room was deliberately dimmed, casting long, suggestive shadows, while soft, ostensibly romantic music played at a low volume in the background, a scene meticulously staged. Ripped straight from the glossy pages of a high-end lifestyle magazine. But it wasn't inviting, it wasn't seductive. It was a performance, a transparent, almost pathetic, last-ditch effort. "I've prepared your absolute favorite, Victor," she announced, her voice infused with a forced, cloying sweetness, gesturing vaguely towards the direction of the kitchen. I didn't sit down. I didn't even pause. "I've already consumed my dinner, Isabel," I stated, my voice flat, devoid of any discernible emotion. The carefully constructed artifice of her composure visibly crumbled. Her face, moments before arranged in a practiced, alluring smile, fell, her eyes reflecting a mixture of shock, hurt, and dawning fury. She followed me, almost stalking me, into the kitchen, her voice steadily rising in pitch and volume. "Why, Victor? Why are you doing this to me? Why are you deliberately, cruelly, shutting me out?" Her tone oscillated wildly, precariously, between raw, unadulterated anger and a pitiful, almost childlike pleading. I turned slowly to face her, my demeanor as calm, as implacable, as ever. "Isabel," I began, my voice low and steady, yet carrying an undeniable undercurrent of finality, "cease this charade. Stop pretending. You are fully, unequivocally aware of what you have done." Her mouth opened, as if to offer a retort, a denial, another fabricated excuse, but no words emerged. That profound, suffocating silence, in that precise moment, was far louder, far more damning, than any tearful, belated confession could ever have been. Her shoulders, previously held rigid with a defiant pride, slumped in utter, abject defeat, the last vestiges of her meticulously maintained mask slipping away, revealing the raw, terrified vulnerability beneath. That night, she cried herself to sleep beside me, her sobs muffled and agonizing, a soundtrack to the death of our marriage. But I offered no comfort, no solace, no gesture of reconciliation. Not anymore. She, and she alone, had meticulously constructed this vast, unbridgeable chasm between us, and now, she was left to drown in its cold, desolate depths, entirely, utterly alone. The ensuing days unfolded with a grim, monotonous predictability. She continued to oscillate, with a dizzying, almost manic intensity, between frigid, bitter accusations and pathetic, self-abasing apologies. Every desperate, transparent attempt to spark some form of reaction from me, any reaction, failed spectacularly, miserably. My unwavering, unyielding indifference was, ironically, her ultimate undoing. She would prod, she would provoke, she would plead, but I steadfastly, resolutely, gave her nothing. One night, as she stood before me, a tragic, disheveled figure, her expensive makeup streaked with tears, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, she whispered, her voice hoarse and trembling, "Please, Victor. I don't even know who I am anymore without you." I believed her. And that, in its devastating simplicity, was precisely the problem. She no longer possessed a coherent sense of her own identity, but I, with a chilling, newfound clarity, certainly knew who she was. A liar.